Well, what it says is that something doesn't make sense on the surface, and I've learned this through a long life as both an investor and as a political activist. That if something doesn't make sense on the surface, then there's something else going on, some other information that you don't have access to. What Trump is saying doesn't make sense.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. We're sticking with Iran today, but of course how this impacts Russia and Putin, and some pretty controversial comments from Donald Trump along with Vladimir Putin and just, I guess, their relationship as of late. So my guest today is Sir Bill Browder. Bill, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Great to be here.
Let's kick off with these comments from Donald Trump, who said that he'd had a very good call with President Putin. He said, we had a lot of people on the line from our side, from his side. We were talking about Ukraine, which is just a never-ending fight. And when, look, there's tremendous hatred between Putin and Zelensky. They can't seem to get it together. But I think it was a positive call on that subject. And we obviously talked then about the Middle East, and Putin wants to be helpful. I said you could be more helpful by getting the Russia-Ukraine war over with. That would be more helpful. But we had a very good talk, and he wants to be constructive. I mean, your reaction, Bill, to Trump signaling that Putin wants to be more helpful?
Well, I mean, it's the whole thing is kind of absurd. I mean, how can Putin be helpful? Putin could be helpful by withdrawing from Ukraine. Putin invaded Ukraine. He continues to invade Ukraine. He continues to kill Ukrainian civilians, bombing Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. He would be helpful if he stopped doing that. That would be the most helpful thing that Vladimir Putin could do. It would also be helpful if Vladimir Putin didn't provide targeting information to the Iranians to hit American soldiers. That would be helpful, and it would be helpful if Putin didn't threaten various other NATO allies with different things. It would be helpful if he didn't dig up internet cables across the Baltics. It would be helpful if he didn't assassinate various people in different countries. So there's a lot of things he could do to be helpful. I don't think he's being particularly helpful at the moment.
I mean, it's almost comical at this point. And something that I found, I mean, funny is probably the wrong word for it, Bill, but on Monday, Putin offered his commitment to Iran publicly. So he said, I would like to reaffirm an unwavering support to Tehran and solidarity with our Iranian friends. Russia has been and will remain a reliable partner to Iran at a time when Iran is confronting armed aggression. Your tenure in this high position will undoubtedly require great courage and dedication. So this is, of course, referring to the fact that there is a new supreme leader. Now, this comes after the fact that Trump has slammed the appointment of Khamenei's son as the new leader, saying it was unacceptable to me. So what does this say about the balance of power in this relationship with Trump and Putin, where Putin is offering his unwavering support to the new supreme leader, that Trump is likely, with the in conjunction with Israel, trying to target and probably likely will kill eventually?
Well, what it says is that something doesn't make sense on the surface. And I've learned this through a long life as both an investor and as a political activist, that if something doesn't make sense on the surface, then there's something else going on, some other information that you don't have access to. What Trump is saying doesn't make sense. So in a normal situation, if a major country aligned itself with an enemy of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States would be very angry with that country that's aligning themselves with the enemy. If Russia has aligned themselves with the enemy of the United States, a country with Iran, a country through which the United States is at war, it would seem logical and sensible that the United States would take drastic and severe action towards that country. That hasn't happened here. So something is going on. What's going on? There's been millions of people speculating over many years. There was of course, Russian hoax the quote Russian hoax that Donald Trump accused everybody of promoting. But here we are in a situation that doesn't make any sense on the surface. And so there's something underneath the surface, whatever that is, that doesn't make sense.
Well, sticking with what's normal, Bill, two major things happened in the last week that you mentioned. So US officials claimed that Russia had been providing Iran with targeting intelligence, i.e., the location of US warships, aircrafts, other military assets in the Middle East. with the purpose, of course, launching strikes on the US. This, as well as the fact that the US requested Ukraine's help in sending drone experts to US military bases. So despite this, Trump still criticized Zelensky and Joe Biden for spending too much money on aid for Ukraine, and then also failed to remotely condemn Putin for sharing intelligence with Iran. So, I mean, make this make sense to me. You and I go back and forth still all the time, but I cannot wrap my head around this.
Well, I mean, you can wrap your head around it if you look at it from a different perspective, that there's a lot of business that the Russians have proposed to the United States, and specifically to people connected to Trump. There was a very, very interesting article a couple months ago written by the Wall Street Journal, which kind of goes in sort of deal by deal of all these different business deals that people close to President Trump want to do. And I suspect that that the incentives, the business incentives, are so overwhelming that they're looking beyond the national security imperatives that these things run across purpose. That's the only thing that could make sense in this situation. It doesn't. There's no national interest in the United States siding with Putin, who has sided with the enemy of the United States. It just doesn't make any sense.
Axios is now reporting that Ukraine offered the US this battle-tested technology to shoot down Iranian drones months ago, but the Trump administration rejected the proposal at the time. So now, of course, they've crawled back to Ukraine. I wonder, is this a major tactical miscalculation, Bill, since Ukraine had already developed this effective counter-drone system fighting Russia's Iranian-made drones?
Well, what we know right now is that the Iranian drones cost between $20 and $30 million to make, and the interceptors, the Patriot missiles and other interceptors cost $4 million plus to intercept, and so you end up with this crazy asymmetry in costs between attack and defense, and of course that can only be done on a very short-term basis. And depending on how long this war goes on for, depending on how deep the reserves are of these Shahed drones that the Iranians are shooting, America and America's allies in the Middle East, the Gulf states, may run out of Patriot missiles and other interceptors to stop these Shahed drones. And therefore, it's absolutely essential that America and its allies come up with some type of more formidable and more symmetric way of defending the airspace in the Middle East. And that would, of course, mean using some of this Ukrainian technology. And so I remember when Donald Trump met with Zelensky in the Oval Office, and he and his Vice President, J.D. Vance, started shouting at Zelensky, saying, "You don't have any cards." Well, here's cards now that they've just showed up with.
As of this week, the Trump administration has temporarily eased these oil-related sanctions on Russia, including, letting India buy Russian oil while the global supply is being impacted by the Iranian war. But then, of course, easing some restrictions on Rosneft's oil refinery. Trump said that we're going to take those sanctions off until this straightens out. Who knows? Maybe we won't put them on. So there's been no change in the Russia-Ukraine war, no surrender, no ceasefire, no successful negotiation. Is lifting these sanctions purely beneficial for Trump in order to stabilize the global energy market, that it doesn't fall on him?
Well, this is a very complicated story. So let's start out with why this is happening. So you have 20% of the world's oil runs through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a very narrow waterway in which Emirati oil, Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil all has to flow through in order to get out to the open market. And so in a situation where the oil market has lost 20% of its supply and countries continue to demand the same amount of oil, then you're in an absolutely desperate situation, which could and has. I mean, we saw the oil price go up to $125 a barrel briefly in response to this. It creates a economic shock which is felt all over the world. And so it's right for all policymakers to say, how do we stabilize this situation? And of course, the first and most important thing to do is try to figure out how to get the oil out of the Middle East, either through the Strait of Hormuz or through alternative means. And as I understand, the Saudis have a pipeline that doesn't that goes to the Red Sea, which is on the other side of Saudi Arabia. It's not affected by the Strait of Hormuz, and they can put about somewhere around half of their oil production through that pipeline, which is significant. I also understand that the Emiratis have another pipeline that also bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, which again doesn't solve the problem. So the first and most important thing is to figure out how to unblock the Strait of Hormuz, and so the oil can continue flowing. Now, it seems, I would say, potentially premature for Trump to lift sanctions on Russia and allow them to sell their oil to whoever they want to sell them to, because what happens there is that the oil was still on the market. It's just a question of who had the guts to buy sanctioned oil. But what happens there now is that the price of Russian oil, or I should say the revenues from Russian oil, probably doubles from here. And what that means is that Vladimir Putin doubles his capacity to continue fighting in Ukraine. And so if Trump, of course, he's got this war to fight in Iran, but he's also got an objective of ending the war in Ukraine. And if Putin is fighting that war because he's got money, and if those sanctions were put on to try to deprive him of that money, then this is just an absolute sort of gift to Vladimir Putin to say you can continue to fight the war. And so to the extent that Donald Trump wants to end the war, this is the last thing he should be doing to try to end this war.
Well, sticking with that, Bill, the war in Iran, it can boost Russia's oil revenue in the short term as the price goes up, and then there are also prominent long-term effects that this conflict could have on Russia. So the Moscow Times is reporting about how Putin does risk losing billions of dollars that he's invested in Iran as, of course, a key ally. So Russia has invested over $4 billion in Iran, mainly in oil and gas projects. These energy projects could collapse. Some developments may never be completed, meaning that Russia will never recover the money. Of course, there's the fact that they're a crucial ally to Moscow. Military cooperation could be disrupted. We know that Iran was selling drones to Russia, but not so much anymore. They've got the technology now. They really build them themselves. But while we've seen Trump go easy on Putin time and time again, and we know that Russia could benefit in the short term, especially with these oil revenues, he still does have a lot to lose from this war.
Well, the main thing that Vladimir Putin is losing from this war is his ability to project power into the rest of the world. So he had, before he went into Ukraine, he had a whole bunch of different allies. He had the Syrian leader, Bashar Assad. He had Maduro in Venezuela. He had Khamenei, the old Khamenei in Iran, as well as the Armenians and all sorts of others. Since he went into Ukraine, he lost Armenia, he lost Venezuela, he lost Syria, and he lost Iran. And so his ability to project power, to be seen as a major player on the world stage, has been dramatically diminished. And I would say that that's more important than $4 billion, because that is effectively his whole thing is to be this madman on the world stage, thumping his chest and trying to scare everybody into submission. If he's not able to do that, if he looks like a weak and unreliable person, then people abroad are not going to take him seriously. And to the extent that people abroad are not taking him seriously, people at home may not take him seriously. And I've always viewed Vladimir Putin as sort of a Potemkin leader. This refers to these Potemkin villages where this is an old story from Russia, where the Tsar rode up into a little village and they put up these fronts and buildings to make everything look really good, but behind it the fronts there was nothing. And that's kind of what Putin is. He's shown himself to be a failure just about everywhere. He's a failure in Ukraine. He was supposed to win this war in 3 days, and it's now 4 years in, and he's a failure all over the world. And so, at some point, this is going to come back to bite him inside of Russia, which is which is the purpose of all this international stuff is to show how strong he is. If he's seen to be weak, the Russian people may say, we don't want this weak guy who can't get stuff done, and we'd rather have somebody else. And if that's the case, then Putin's desperate quest to survive will fail. And that's what everything that's all he's thinking about really, is just personal survival.
What did you make of his comments that Russia is ready to resume supplying oil and gas to Europe if European countries request it? Just going on with what's happening in the war, of course, we know that Slovakia and Hungary still do receive oil from Russia, but he's basically said that he never refused energy cooperation with Europe, and said that Moscow is ready to work with Europeans if they signal that they want to restore these energy ties.
Well, I think that he's just taunting the Europeans. Of course, Europe understands that they don't want to give money to the man who's threatened to invade them. I mean, that's pretty stupid and very serious. But for what it's worth, Vladimir Putin was the one who cut off natural gas supplies to Europe. Europe used to be completely dependent on Russian natural gas. And then one day, as part of his early foray into trying to intimidate Europe into not supporting Ukraine, he said, I'm going to cut off natural gas. And he did. And so countries like Germany, who get like more than a third of their natural gas, had to find other sources of natural gas at a huge cost to Germany. But now everybody is more or less sort of found alternative supplies. Yes, of course, the price has risen dramatically because of this war in Iran, but that seems to be temporary. It certainly only went up to $125 a barrel, the oil did, and then it came back down again. And so I think that this is just him taunting Europe. I don't think Europe is going to change their approach to Russia. Now, if oil were to stay at $125 or $150 a barrel for a long period of time, and there was a shortage, then all bets are off on what Europe would do. But I think in this very short-term situation, nobody's going to change their policy towards Russian oil and gas in Europe.
I want to get your thoughts on this clip that's going viral from Trump speaking to reporters. We've had a lot of back and forth and conflicting messaging from the Trump administration saying that, they're nearing to the end of the war, but they've still got so much to go. There was a 4 to 6 week timeline, but then we're going to wrap up soon. But around 10 days ago, Bill, a girls' school in Iran was bombed, killing around 150, 180 civilians. Reports now suggest through images and investigations and videos that the strike was carried out by the US using a Tomahawk cruise missile. So Trump downplayed this to reporters and suggested that Iran might likely be responsible for this. But that prompted a reporter to ask him that you just suggested that Iran somehow got its hand on a Tomahawk, bombed its own elementary school on the first day of the war. Why are you the only person in your administration saying this? Trump said, because I don't know enough about it. I think that's something that I was told is under investigation, but Tomahawks are used by others. As you know, numerous other nations have Tomahawks. They buy them from us. But Tomahawks are manufactured in the United States. They're only sold to 4 other countries, the UK, Australia, Japan, and the Netherlands, I think they are. So we also know from you and I talking that from the Russia-Ukraine war that Tomahawk missiles are incredibly sought after. So Trump essentially just lied to Americans about the fact that the US militants carried out this strike on a girls' school and said that Iran managed to steal a Tomahawk missile and bomb their own school.
Well, it's a very distressing situation when the most powerful man in the free world, against all evidence, presents a series of facts which aren't true. Of course, this is not the first time that's happened, and it won't be the last time, but it definitely degrades the dignity of the United States and the credibility of the United States when the commander-in-chief makes sort of certain public statements which are contrary to the facts.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.